All right. Well, welcome everybody. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Ha'a Solomon to get started with our workshop today.
Mahalo, Anna. Aloha kako. Waipuna lau ke aloha. Belina ho'i manua I kalehu aloha. Good morning, good evening. Here it's about 8 a.m. Beautiful day in Honolulu, Hawaii. And I'm happy to be here with you folks. I'll share my screen in a couple seconds. I'm actually making coffee at the same time. So let's share. We have a couple slides today to talk about our topic, which I love talking about. This can be very discussion oriented, even in the form of you folks sending messages in the chat. And I will try to keep an eye on that so we can keep it discussion oriented. And then I believe we'll have time for discussion and or questions at the end. And this should take about an hour. Sound good? So mahalo everyone for joining us. This is our presentation today. We're talking about TEK, which is a popular acronym that stands for Traditional Ecological Knowledge. My name is Noah Haʻalilio Solomon. I usually go by Ha'a for short. And I like to open up this presentation with an example of a piece, a very important piece of traditional ecological knowledge, which is the name of the moon phase in the Hawaiian lunar cycle, as well as the name of the month. And today is known as La'aupau in the month of Ikua. And La'aupau actually started last night when the moon rose during the night. So instead of counting days when the sun rises, like in a Western calendar or maybe a Gregorian perspective or worldview, La'aupau actually in a Hawaiian universe, also in Polynesia, the night of the day begins when the moon rises. So we are still during the day of La'aupau in the month of Ikua. So we'll take that as an example of how sometimes the way knowledge is stored and organized and created and produced and also transmitted can be very different from how other knowledge systems are created as well. Neat. Robin Hanks, similar in Ojibwe about lunar cycles. Mahalo for sharing. So of course today is November 3rd, 2023, but we would say in a Hawaiian universe, it's La'aupau ikamahina o La'aupau kapo. La'aupau is the night, o Ikua kamahina. Ikua is the month. Helu anu o kamahalo. Many mahalo, many thanks that I want to send to Anna Baloo and everyone at ELP, Endangered Languages Project. Also, the folks at the University of Hawaii at Manoa's Linguistics Department, where I'm actually currently finishing a PhD. So that's who I am. I teach at UH, the University of Hawaii at Manoa. I teach Olelo Hawaii, Hawaiian language. I would consider it my heritage language, but not my first language. I learned it as an adult. As many people, I would say a majority of the speakers of Hawaiian language learned Olelo Hawaii as adults. There is a pretty robust immersion education program that transmits the language to keiki or children, starting from a very young age, even from the womb, we would say. And we also have educational options where those children can continue a Hawaiian language medium education all the way up until university. At the university, I'm also in the linguistics department, as I mentioned. That's where I did my master's degree, and that's where I'm currently finishing my PhD, and I have about 6 months to finish. The topic of my dissertation will probably come up during this discussion at some point. But otherwise, my interests are language revitalization, language shift, language attitudes. There's my dissertation topic, actually. And of course, what we're talking about today, the topic being traditional ecological knowledge. TEK. TEK is a very prominent theme in the classes that I teach and how I teach, etc. So I think it goes without saying, but it's also a good reminder that language and culture are interconnected. And I like this quote about the interconnectedness between a language and culture cannot be overstated. Usually a certain language, or at least a language variety, identifies a specific group of people. So engaging with another language means engaging with a language tied to it. Tied to them, I should say. And therefore, we cannot understand a culture without understanding its language, and vice versa. And I think this is always a good reminder for me, especially as a language teacher, a teacher of Hawaiian language in Hawaii, where English is dominant, and lots of people, most people, I would say, who speak, most Hawaiian language speakers are also asked to do Hawaiian cultural things, Hawaiian cultural activities, or Hawaiian cultural protocols, for example. And in theory, if we're teaching language, we're also teaching culture and history, but sometimes those are not all taught in tandem with one another. So it's a good reminder that the curriculum in a language revitalization program or campaign or a movement should really prioritize teaching language and culture together, and they should support each other. Or else we have that situation today where there are speakers of the language, but not necessarily, who aren't necessarily literate in culture, or vice versa. Cultural practitioners who might not speak the language. So it's really important that we prioritize those two things together. Also, for language documentation and conservation, it's important to understand the interconnectedness of language and culture, of course, as I mentioned earlier. Also, to recognize the importance of culture and tradition, and cultural and traditional knowledge, and how important that is, which has sort of in the field of linguistics only recently been, in the last couple of decades, I would say, really come to the forefront of importance and focus. We also want to recognize the biodiversity that exists among, across, and between cultures as we strive to document and conserve cultural, traditional, and ecological knowledge systems. What we might call epistemes. That's another big word we'll probably use several times today. So in Hawaii, we have a very, very important concept of kuleana. And kuleana is a interesting and sort of complex word and concept, a very unique cultural concept, unique to Hawaii. I haven't necessarily encountered this in any other place, even places that are closely related to Hawaii in other areas of Polynesia. But kuleana basically is showing a commitment and a very deep responsibility to something or someone, And because of your commitment, you have a privilege, you have the privilege to access that something or someone. And it's sort of a reciprocal and sort of cyclical kind of situation. Where if I have kuleana to Olelo Hawaii, meaning I commit to the language, to the future of the language, to the fate of the language, to the health of the language, to the vitality of the language, then my commitment also affords me a say or a stake or a claim in that language. I have the privilege of speaking about that language. So with that in mind, a good reminder is that the field of linguistics has a kuleana to empower communities so they have the means to determine their own linguistic destiny. I love this quote from Andrea Perez-Pilter. Andrea is a professor in the linguistics department at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, actually where Anna and I met. And if we're talking about empowerment, then part of that empowerment is the thorough documentation of language that's informed by paying attention to what matters to the community, what is important to them, and therefore what is worthy of knowing and transmitting. Now, this sounds like common sense, but for a long time, language documentation and language documentarians have been sort of more, maybe in the past, have been motivated by what they think is important and have been inspired by their own biases when they were doing their field work, for example. So we are trying to prioritize the desires, priorities, needs of the communities that we're working with, and what they say is important and worthwhile. In other words, what would they want their children to know and remember, and also pass on to their children? So what is TEK? Or another way of asking this question might be, how do we define cultural and traditional knowledge? Traditional ecological knowledge. Again, this sort of sounds like an obvious question. It's just knowledge that is steeped in tradition and communicated and maintained via culture or cultural practice. But we also want to introduce into this concept the notion of epistemology. And epistemology is not just knowledge that's a unique knowledge system to a certain group of people, but also how that knowledge comes into existence, how that knowledge was born, and how that knowledge is organized, which is very interesting it's an interesting point of discussion when we actually take all of those factors into consideration, when we actually consider all those differences of knowledge. If we recall our example from the very first slide, the traditional and cultural knowledge encoded in a Hawaiian lunar calendar has very agricultural and aquacultural implications. The reason why Eastern Polynesians name the nights and the lunar cycles is because there is a correlation between the moon phases as well as agricultural trends, farming trends, as well as fishing trends. So on certain nights, we don't plant this. On other nights, we don't fish for this type of species. On other nights, it is a good, fruitful night to plant certain things and fish for certain species, etc. And if that's sort of governing our economy, it's going to create a different reality than if, a Western reality, which doesn't necessarily use the moon phases to dictate what is good to farm and what is good to fish. So we start to see very quickly some pretty clear differences. I think at this point, I might have to stop sharing screen to reshare so you folks hear the audio, but I would like to take 3 minutes of our time to watch a mo'olelo oiwi, or we might call this a ka'ao, a traditional story that is in Olelo Hawaii, in Hawaiian language called He'e me iole. Here's our he'e, our squid or octopus, and here's our iole, our rat. One is a terrestrial land animal, the other, of course, is a marine sea animal. And this story is usually taught to children at young ages to start to encode all kinds of knowledges and knowledge systems and epistemologies that are very culturally, linguistically, historically relevant. So I'm gonna stop share real quick so I can make sure I share my sound as well. And then I'll ask for no more than 3 minutes of your folks' time so we can watch this.
I ka wā kahiko, o noho kekahi iole me kona ohana, ma ka moku puni o moko li'i. I ke kahi la, make oia e hele aku I kane ohe. Ua loa a iaia he wa'a, a hoia kula oia I kualoa. I kona hiki ana mai, ua ho'opa'a ia ka wa'a ma ke kumuniu, a hele kula ka iole I kane ohe. Aka, a ole I ho'opa'a pono ia ka wa'a. No laila, I kona hiki ana mai kane ohe mai, ua lilo ka wa'a I ke kai. Ka pilikia nui. Ua noho I hola ka iole a we me ka leo nui loa. Ua lohe ia kona we ana e ke kahi he'e loko mai kai. Ni nao kula ka he'e iaia.
Ei nei, e ha kou pilikia.
A pane mai la ka iole.
Ua nalo wale ko wa'a. Ua lilo paha I ke kai. No ka mea, a ole paha mai kai ko u ho'opa'a ana. A ole hiki ia'u ke ho'i aku I mokoli'i. No ka mea, a ole hiki ia'u ke au.
Pane mai la ka he'e na au palu palu.
A ole pilikia, hiki paha ia'u ke kokua aku ia oe. E pi'i a e oe I luna o ko'u po'o. A e ho'i aku au ia oe I kou home.
I ke kau ano ka iole maluna kona po'o, ua ho'omaka ka he'e e ho'i aku I mokoli'i. Ka nui o ko ka iole maka'u. Aka, ka hea kula ka he'e.
E noho mali e oe, mai makau. Kama aina loa au I ke ia kai.
Ma hope iho, ua hiki kula lao I mokoli'i. Ua iho I hola ka iole, mai luna iho ko ka he'e po'o. Aha ia kula o ia iaia.
Ke mahalo nui aku nei au ia oe no kou lawe ana mai ia'u. Ai ke kahi makana nao maluna o kou po'o.
A hola awivia kula ka iole I uka. Ua haha ela ka he'e maluna kona po'o. A loa'a ke kukai. Ua ki'o ka iole maluna ke po'o no ka mea maka'u loa o ia. Ka huhu nui o ka he'e. Mai ke la manawa mai, I nā ike ia ka leho e ka he'e. Ua lalau o ia iaia no ka mea mana'o o ia o ka iole no ia. Hana ka po'e Pakipika I ke kahi mea I kapa ia he lū he'e. Me ka pōhaku a me ka leho. A loa'a ka he'e ia lako me ke ia mea.
Pipi holo ka ao.
So, yes, Siramahi was Iole was very sad. So obviously this mo'olelo, this story was narrated in Olelo, Hawaii. But the gist of it, let me go back. Full screen. I'm gonna go and share my full screen. The gist of the story is Iole is from an island just off the coast of Oahu, where I live, and he wants to get to the main island. And so he paddles his canoe. But when he ties it to a kumuniu, a coconut tree, he doesn't tie it well enough. So the sea, the ocean, takes his canoe, and when he comes back after running his errands, and he's ready to go home, he cannot go back because his va'a has been lost, and he cannot swim. So the he'e, he starts to cry. And so he'e, the squid, hears him crying and says, "Oh, what's going on? Are you okay?" And so Iole explains his situation, and he'e says, "I can help you. Just come, hop onto my head, and I'll swim you back just across the channel." So Iole jumps on, and Iole becomes very, very scared during this commute. And Iole gets so scared that he actually makes waste on his head because he's so scared. And when he gets to his home, Iole says, "Okay, mahalo, thank you, He'e. Thank you for taking me back. Because of your kind gesture, I left a gift on your head." And the gift is, of course, his waist, which might sound inappropriate in some cultures, but in this tradition, it's not necessarily. It's sort of funny. And that's the gift that Iole leaves He'e to thank him for helping him before he runs off to his home. And since then, this story establishes sort of a conflict or rivalry between He'e and Iole. And so when fishermen want to go and catch squid or octopus, they'll use that material cultural object that we saw at the very end called the luhe'e. Because the luhe'e is supposed to simulate a mouse and Iole. And so when the he'e sees that, thinking it's going to get its revenge, it'll go for the luhe'e. It'll try to grab it. And that's how fishermen can catch he'e. And we still use luhe'e today. So this mo'olelo gives us an origin story of that technology, while also including a few other important factors, which I will talk about. Marlene, we use Procreate, an app that's readily available on iPads and tablets. Marlene is asking, what program do we use to create the story? And the video was Procreate. Yes, mahalo for asking. Not again. So this is one example of a story that gives us an idea of what's important in not just Hawaiian language, Olelo Hawaii, but in a Hawaiian world, in a Hawaiian universe, in a Hawaiian perspective and worldview and all of those things. And everything that was included is of some import. We have an important ecology, which is the main setting of the whole mo'olelo, which is land and ocean. Of course, for oceanic people, island people, that sort of ecosystem is the setting of many of these types of stories, especially the didactic stories, the stories that are teaching something, the stories that encode traditional epistemologies and knowledge. We have He'e and Iole interacting. So there's biology and a sort of a biodiversity representation. We have technology represented, the va'a, of course, being the canoe, canoes are very important in oceanic history. We have luhe'e, the octopus or the squid lure. This mo'olelo is also chock full of place names of mountains and oceans and channels and beaches. And so all of these names are encoding geography, spatial literacy, and space making. They hold the space and they also give meaning to the space. Via the origin and creation story, we have an ontological or cosmogonic representation. We see a sociological kind of representation in the relationships between He'e and Iole. And we also have an appeal to ethos, or an articulation of the value systems that that are also very important when it comes to language revitalization or language maintenance, especially in a context like Hawaii, where ethnic Hawaiians are demographically a minority in our own home. So there's a lot of cultural contact, and if it makes it a little bit harder for us to maintain and transmit the Hawaiian culture and make sure it stays vital. So together, these knowledge systems are comprising what we would call a language's worldview. And for every language, there's a worldview that is very, very unique and particular to that language. And really I've heard the worldview defined in many different ways, but a language's worldview is sort of the essence, or we might call it Hawaiian the mauli of the language and its speakers. And if it's because the worldview is so important, we have a kuleana to pay attention to the worldview. And in language documentation and conservation, then it should be sort of language and worldview documentation and conservation, because of the importance of a worldview that's so closely connected to the language. Yeah.
Hey,
So
Ha'a, sorry to interrupt. We have a clarification question in the chat. Do you mind unpacking the terms spatial literacy, space making, ontology, and kuleana for folks?
Oh, sure. And I might ask you to repeat those words. So kuleana was first. I think Reinhard asked about kuleana. So kuleana is a culturally Hawaiian concept, and it means several things. I would say it's, at its core, it means a commitment or a responsibility, but at the same time, a stake or a privilege. So if I have kuleana to hula, for example, I'm a hula dancer for a long time, and hula is, of course, the traditional dance of Hawaii, but also a way of storytelling. And like all storytelling, there's knowledge encoded. So if hula is encoding knowledge, then that's something important. I have kuleana to that method of storytelling and that method of that system of knowledge. And if I have kuleana to it, it means I'm committed to it. I have the best interest of, I have hula's best interest at heart, in my heart. I want the best for hula and its future. And because I have that commitment and that kuleana to it, I also have, I deserve a say in it. I have a stake in it. And as a stakeholder, I have a privilege to accessing that knowledge, and to, I have a privilege to even just practicing hula. So that's what kuleana is. It's a marriage of responsibility and privilege. And to be responsible to something affords you the privilege, but only because you're responsible to it, you're committed to it. And it sort of works in those two ways. I shouldn't be entitled to something if I'm not responsible to it. And I shouldn't be responsible to something if I'm, that sounds kind of bad. I shouldn't necessarily be responsible to something if I'm not entitled to it as well. That's the idea of kuleana. If you look up kuleana in the dictionary, the Hawaiian Language Dictionary, you'll get a paragraph of meanings because it's such a complex concept. Spatial literacy, I think. Spatial literacy, the idea of literacy being more about being beyond just written literacy or reading and writing. I'm not too sure of the background of when alternative literacies began, were introduced as a concept. But I do know that something like spatial literacy is also a literacy that should be recognized as being a cognitive skill. And when people are, especially speakers of oral languages, societies of oral histories, space making and how they organize space and what kinds of names they're putting onto their space, whether it's a place name of a mountain peak or a mountain range or a beach or a stone, an important event that happened that becomes mapped onto the landscape. That's what we mean by space making. And the intimate knowledge of that space making is what we would call spatial literacy. Some, I believe more so, linguistic anthropologists have they've argued that for post-literate societies, they sort of organize their world and all the events in it on a timeline, whereas pre-literate societies who have more oral traditions, less writing, if any writing at all, those pre-literate societies are organizing their entire existence and the events that happen in their existence. Instead of a time axis, they're using a space axis. So space becomes very important, space and place. Not to say time isn't important in that, but they also have the access of space. So their entire history and existence is mapped onto space a little bit more than it's mapped onto time. Yeah. When we're talking about ontology, let me go back to the slide. Ontology just meaning the existence. Ontology is the sort of the branch of science that wants to know about being, how things come into being, what comprises their being. And so we have in the Mo'olelo He and Iole story, we have notions of how things came into being. This Mo'olelo doesn't have people in it. So this might be that it was before Hawaii was settled by humans. Yeah. So that's the idea that a lot of these very traditional stories have important implications on the existence and being of that place and that people, the keepers of those stories and the keepers of those languages. Yes, good questions. I hope that answered your questions. Feel free to ask more. Let me see, where are we? Okay, so we have about 20 minutes left, which is enough time for me to cover 3 specific examples of things that would most definitely be documented in traditional language documentation and conservation, but not just from a linguistics or a language perspective. There are also very, very important cultural implications that these 3 examples have. Before we get to those, though, I think this slide is also important. The story that we just watched also has a lot of kinship terms, knowledge, and think. Seji, do you mind if I mute you? Is that okay? I just muted you, Seji. Mahalo for joining us. This story, the video, the mo'olelo we just watched has all kinds of other things that are important as well, such as kinship terms, taxonomies, or other indexable knowledge systems. We saw lots of botanical information, technology, cultural, traditional, ecological knowledge. So all of these ways are different ways of knowing. Again, we have this term, alternative literacies and epistemologies that are encoded in a way that might be obvious. It doesn't seem like I said earlier, the He'e and Iole story is sort of for children. But I think that's what is so important about these stories that are taught to children, is because they can also be, of course, educational for adults. They become very important in a Hawaiian a revitalization setting. In the language revitalization, they're very important because everything about them is teaching us something. Yeah, and of course they're in the language. They're written and told in Hawaiian language or in whatever language we're trying to revitalize. So they are very valuable. 3 examples from Hawaii about traditional ecological knowledge. And they're important in an ecological way, in a material culture way, in a folkloric way, and also, of course, a linguistic way. The first thing I want to talk about is this tree where this blossom comes from. The tree is called Hekumu Ohia, or Hekumu Ohia Lehua, Ohia Lehua tree. This Lehua blossom grows on the Ohia Lehua. From an ecological perspective, this is the Latin name of this species. Ohia probably is related to the word ohi, meaning to gather. And we know that ecologically speaking, the ohia gathers lots of water. Anytime Pele flows, there's a new lava flow in Hawaii. It's almost magical. Something about that setting dictates that the first plant or tree to grow out of a new lava flow is this Ohia Lehua tree. And of course, knowing that the Ohia gathers water and holds water, that's very important because water and lava certainly don't mix. And the Ohia Lehua also corresponds to a certain variety of kalo in what we would call an epistemological pair. So there's Lehua, the tree, and then there's Lehua kalo or taro. And those two are sort of related in a Hawaiian thought process or in the Hawaiian universe to bring balance to the aina, to bring balance to the land and to the ecosystem. Balance is very important in a Hawaiian universe. The Ohia Lehua is used for many, many things. The hardwood makes for great umeke wooden bowls. the bigger the trunks are used for, ba'a, or canoes, like the one we saw earlier that brought Iole over to Oahu. The leaves and blossoms are used in lei making. Some of the most beautiful and prized lei are used. They use this, the lehua blossoms, and culturally, it's very significant in hula. Partly because the ohia lehua is important in the mythscape of Hawaii. There are many, many, many mo'olelo that feature the ohia lehua tree and its spirit, where sometimes an ohia lehua is the conversion of someone, maybe a forlorn lover, a lover who is very sad becomes stays in mourning at a certain place for so long and becomes a lehua tree. They become, their entire existence is converted into an ohia lehua tree. So the ohia lehua is very symbolic of love, of female energy, and then also the way the birds sip on the nectar. Our Manu Hawaii, our Hawaiian birds, love to sip of the nectar of the ohia lehua tree. And so that has been, that symbol, that metaphor has become innuendo. Yeah. Linguistically, of course, it's very important because the word lehua has many meanings. One meaning is an expert, someone who is swift and strong, like a warrior. The best warrior on the battlefield would probably be called a lehua. Also, the first warrior to start the battle or to wage the battle is called a lehua. Lehua also describes someone who is a sweetheart or a beloved friend or relative, among other poetic references as well. Yeah. So that was the first example, the ohia lehua tree. Another tree, our second example, is kukui. You folks have probably seen some part of this tree, the way it's become very popular and useful and even trendy to use the nuts that grow. Kukui nuts from a kukui tree are often strung into a lei. Yeah. But ecologically speaking, the kukui tree is, the nickname is the candle nut tree because the nuts are burned to be used as firelight, as a torch. And they're important in the forest for their size and their strength and their regulation of the entire ecosystem because of their size and strength. Here we see the nuts just after they are sort of roasted, I believe. The softwood can be used for canoes. The sap of a kukui tree can be used for many things, particularly to catch birds to pluck their feathers and then you release them. The bark also makes dyes when we're dyeing kapa or bark cloth. The nuts are chewed to make sort of a chum or a palu for fishing to attract fish. Of course, they're used in lei making. But my favorite, the biggest, most significant reason I am grateful for the kukui tree is because we cook the nuts into what we call inamona. And inamona is a Hawaiian condiment. It tastes like a savory sort of kind of a powder that you can put on fish, and it's just delicious. In the folkloric or the mythscape, kukui is also important because the kukui tree and the leaves themselves are a kinolau of kamapua'a. A kinolau is a physical body or a physical manifestation of a spirit form. And so the physical manifestation of the spirit form of Kamapua'a, we have hundreds of mo'olelo of stories of that are about this person, this kupua, this shapeshifter, this magical being, and his name is Kamapua'a. And he's sort of the comedic relief in a Hawaiian mythscape. But he takes the form of the kukui. He physically manifests in the kukui tree. One indication of this is because pua'a, or hogs, Hawaiian pigs, eat the nuts of the kukui tree. And the leaf of the kukui actually represents the snout and the ears. And we see this if we look at the face of Kamapua'a. You can see the shape of Kamapua'a's head. Linguistically, kukui means a lamp or a light or a torch, as I mentioned earlier. So symbolically, metaphorically, a kukui is a leader and a guide. And to attain kukui is to attain wisdom and enlightenment. And to be in the malu kukui, in the shade of kukui, is to have questionable genealogy. So this tree has all kinds of sort of idiomatic meanings as well. Here's our last and final example of something that is important in different ways other than just the linguistic name. And this example is called an iwa bird, a shore bird. Ecologically, iwa are important because they're shorebirds, so they actually are sort of at the top of the food chain of the aviary food chain. I think I'm saying that right. They eat the other bird. They eat the food of other birds, and they're so sort of predatory that they force other birds to disgorge their food and give up their food so the iwa can eat it. Beyond that, their feathers are important because they're at the top of the ecosystem's hierarchy and at the top of the food chain. And they soar so high that their feathers are symbolic of nobility and honor and loftiness. So their feathers are used in as gifts for someone who has the same sort of honor and nobility. They're also woven into lei and kahili, which are symbols of royalty. Because of their behavior, instinctual behavior, their navigational aids, they're expert fish spotters, they're expert land spotters over the ocean. They can see islands from miles and miles away. And because of that importance to humans, they become a motif. So you'll see a lot of iwa birds in traditional Hawaiian tattoos. And also there's a fern on land called the iwa fern, sometimes called iwa, sometimes the reduplicated form. So here we have the bird iwa and then the fern iwa, and again, like the kalo and ohi'alehua tree earlier, we have an epistemological pair, a pair that brings balance to the ecosystem. But probably something that, unless you're sort of actively, conscientiously looking for this kind of knowledge, that would probably not be documented in a traditional language documentation field project. So it's important that we're paying attention to these knowledge systems as well. And iwa is also symbolic of an attractive person. It's figuratively used to denote thievery because of their skill and because of the way they steal other birds' food. Their navigational skills are highly noted, and they're also the parent to the Kauaʻe bird. So here we have an iwa and a Kauaʻe underneath. If we say kikaha ka iwa, the iwa bird soars. That would be the translation of kikaha ka iwa. The iwa bird soars just means somebody is attractive. The iwa sometimes is pronounced without the, well, it corresponds to the number 9 in Hawaiian, which is a cognate of the Polynesian word for number 9. And so this bird is so important that actually it became one of King Kamehameha's names. One of his epithets is Kaiba Kilo Moku, the iwa bird who snatches up islands. And Kamehameha gained this nickname when he snatched all the islands and united them under a single kingdom in the early 1800s. So the iwa became part of his name. I think it will be safe to assume that you folks have sort of asked yourselves this question, or maybe have been wanting to ask this question that we see on the screen. We've talked a lot about traditional, cultural, ecological knowledge, but the question, this sort of begs the question, should all of that knowledge be documented? Shirama is saying the answer is no. That is up to you folks to decide, to the communities you're working with to decide. We know that some forms of knowledge are sacred and they're not meant to be shared publicly. Even today, these 3 examples, the Ohi'a, Kukui, and the iwa, are maybe general enough to be shared publicly, but other forms of other Hawaiian epistemologies are not. Yeah, I wouldn't be comfortable sharing them in a public setting. And if they're not, that's okay too. Yeah. So this is an important reminder and an important note to sort of end on. We've talked a lot about the diversity of biological diversity, botanical diversity, cultural diversity, but all of that diversity doesn't necessarily, diversity doesn't mean public. Yeah. So what are some solutions to make sure that this knowledge is passed on appropriately in appropriate ways? I think that is the question I want to leave you folks, and maybe if we have time, we can discuss it a little bit. Here's that paragraph in the Hawaiian dictionary defining kuleana. Responsibility and privilege in a cyclical sort of situation. Let me try to see how many more slides I have. This maybe about 4 slides. Other questions I might want you folks to think about and answer if you have time. What are some examples of different knowledge systems or epistemes in your own communities or the communities where you work? How do we make sure to value them equally? And to re-invoke this concept of kuleana. What is your kuleana to language and to your culture, to your community or the community that you're working with? More importantly, what is the researcher's kuleana or the outsider's kuleana to their own research, to the language and culture of the people that they're working with? What is their kuleana to the community of speakers they're working with? And sort of, these questions are not rhetorical. Maybe we're not answering them one at a time. Maybe everybody's not answering them. at least now, but it's a great point. All of these are good points of reflection and introspection. Here are my references, and it's 2 minutes to the top of the hour. Let me stop sharing real quick. And check the chat. Mahalo you folks for joining us today. I'm just going to read some of the questions real quick. What do you think of language as, what did it go? Means of communication and language as an identity. Which view do you think is more important, is more appropriate? Language as a means of communication versus language as an identity. I think sometimes for some people it's both, and they're both equally important. But for most people, as we are in this, the decade of empowering indigenous languages, for maybe Olelo Hawaii, Hawaiian language, I would say Hawaiian language as an identity marker, Hawaiian language as a marker of Hawaiian identity, is more prevalent, is more salient, is more prominent, just because we're in the process of revitalizing our language. So many people identify as Hawaiian and use Hawaiian language as one of those identity markers, but they're not necessarily using it as a means of communication. So ideally, a language marks an identity and a language communicates. It's the code of communication for those people who identify with it. But unfortunately, sometimes that's not always, both are not the reality, at least not at the moment. So we're working towards Hawaiian language being both a marker of identity and our means of communication, but we're not there yet. At least not on a macro scale, at least not as a majority of the people who live in Hawaii. But that's a really interesting question. And that's just my take on it. Let's see. I think a philosophical question, sure. Let's see. Are there any other ontological elements that could be added to those of space, time, taxonomy, and others that we know about? I mean, maybe a certain language may not only have a certain way of speaking about space, but an entirely different way of speaking about life, without even having the idea of space in any way. Sorry for the confabulate. I don't think that's a confabulate question at all. Shushan, thank you for this question. We don't know what we don't know. We know that certain fields, the assumption for a long time was knowledge is the same. And the more we sort of document, the more we study, and the more different people are liberated and prioritized for their for the contribution that their culture, their language, their history, their worldview makes to the ethnosphere, we are seeing a whole lot of very beautiful diversity. So I guess to answer your question, Shushan, I wouldn't ever be surprised if we find, if and when we find all kinds of different conceptualizations of existence, different conceptualizations of time and space, and the way the language encodes that, just to be so diverse and so unique. So it's, I find hope in that kind of possibility. Yeah, great question. Any other questions? I think I got to every question in the chat. It's just really nice to have such an engaged audience. Sure, Sinam, I think we have time for questions. I have about 10 more minutes. Mahalo, Jean, and everyone else.
Sorry, I'm gonna turn on my mic because I think it's easier. I'm grateful for this class today. Thank you so much. It's been very moving and very informative and educational. I had a question about the word mythscape. Does that mean like is that the word for traditional stories?
Mythscape, I saw in a early 90s anthropology paper, and I liked the word. I know
It's a good word.
yeah, there is some controversy around it, around the word myth in general.
Yeah.
But I like scape. I like it when it's combined with scape because it sort of puts the mythology back onto the landscape.
Yeah, the ecology. Yeah, I get that. Thank you. And then I had some questions, and I don't know if you're able to really disclose this information because it's like more along the lines of culture, but I had some questions about, I think his name is Iwi or Iwa, the bird. The first one maybe is not so culturally, but it's about, you said that he's a parent to another bird, and I'm assuming that you're discussing two species of birds. Is that true?
Yeah, the sort of, when I say parent, it's the mythological genealogical parent. I wouldn't say biological.
Is so then if we didn't know really like how biology is studied, would you say that Olelo Hawaii has a word for a relationship between two species that have a relationship of family? Basically what I'm getting at is I have a theory that in my language there is botanical taxonomy that is built into the language, and I'm wondering if that is something that you might be able to notice in Olelo Hawaii. Like, is this bird a parent of this bird because at some point there was an understanding that they were closer in species together, maybe?
Interesting question. I would have to do a little bit more research on that relationship, that particular relationship between Eva and Kauai. But I would say relationships, words that we have for relationships such as parent and child or grandparent and grandchild are certainly not limited to biological relationship.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And again, about relationships, and you let me know if I'm overstepping here, but you discussed something called epistemological pairs, lehua and kalo. And then there's another one that I didn't write down, but would you be able to share a little bit about how those, what those interactions are between those, biological, like between those beings or between those plant,
Sure. So in the Hawaiian creation chant, we have several Hawaiian creation chants, the creation of the Hawaiian universe. But one of the most important is called the Kumulipo. And the Kumulipo talks about everything in the Hawaiian universe having a birth when it emerged from the dark night, like a full night, and was born in the daylight. And the order is important, of course, the order in which all of these biological species were born. And not just the order, but also the fact that sometimes it's a coral polyp called a koa, and that's the one born in the sea. and then the koa on land is born at the same time.
Okay.
So the birth of those two elements at the same time in two different places in the ecosystem, sort of they bring a balance to the Hawaiian world.
Right. Okay.
Sometimes the two elements are both on land, sometimes they're both in the sea, sometimes one in the sea, one on land. But those two in the pair are always born at the same time. And they strike a balance and they bring what we call pono, or balanced safety and peace to the land and people who are living on it.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's incredible. Thank you for sharing that part of your worldview and culture with us. Thank you.
Sure. Abderazak, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. How does globalization affect local identities and threats in languages? In my experience, mostly negatively. In Hawaii, we have a huge issue, ongoing issue of exploitation of culture and language for economic gain, financial gain, cultural appropriation, linguistic appropriation, or misappropriation is a huge problem that I don't think would be as severe if globalization wasn't so powerful. So globalization has motivated many people who are not Hawaiian, or maybe don't even live here, to appropriate Hawaiian things culturally and linguistically to commercialize something. Yeah. Unfortunately. I hope that answers your question. Hello, great men. Hello, Wasim. Shushan, one more question. I've stumbled upon studies that indicate that some 7 to 10% of words are untranslatable in language. This is, of course, very unreliable. Any estimates of 10% stand at in language? You know, that's a great question. How many Hawaiian words are untranslatable into another language? Well, not just any language. There's, of course, much translatability when translating between Hawaiian and Tahitian, for example, or Hawaiian and Maori, because of the proximity of the cultures and the languages. Into English, it's a different story. But what I think is interesting, Shushan, thanks for asking this question. It's a great question. Just yesterday, somebody told me that translation is violence. And I never thought about that in that way. Translation as violence. Something spoken in a language, especially an indigenous language or not, but a language, something spoken in a language in a setting where the language has been spoken for a long time, many generations, maybe many centuries, maybe many millennia. Something spoken in that language where it's normalized in that linguistic ecosystem shouldn't be translated and sort of imparted and sort of communicated to somewhere else in the world to a people who don't speak that language. And I'd never thought about this concept as translation as violence, but it's an interesting, compelling idea for me, just because of the problems that we run into when we translate, because of incongruent cultural concepts that do not fit in line with one another, and the assumption of translatability. I think that's at the core of the problem. People assume that this is translatable. So at the Hawaiian Language Department where I work, we get calls maybe daily. People will call our department and ask, I love Hawaii. I love the Hawaiian language. Can you give my child or my grandchild a name? Can you translate this name that I've been thinking of in English? Can you just translate it into Hawaiian and that will become their name? And I think that's a pretty egregious example of the assumption of translatability, and sort of the entitlement. If we're talking about Kuleana, these folks don't have a commitment to the Hawaiian language beyond their sort of superficial attraction to it. And so I don't think giving a Hawaiian name, passing on a Hawaiian name for those people is appropriate. But very good question. Shushan, all for your great questions. And I'm glad I pronounced your name correctly. Speaking about appropriation, does your department people have a legal mechanism for non-indigenous? We do not, Diana, we do not. I think if we did, we would have a lot more autonomy. I think if we did, we wouldn't see the kind of lawsuits that actually sometimes make headlines. I think it was around 2018. Somebody tried to copyright, a non-Hawaiian person, non-speaker, non-local person, tried to copyright the word aloha when he opened up a poke shop. If you folks don't know what poke is, it's diced raw fish that you mix in with a lot of other yummy things, and it's a very popular dish to eat. It's been popular forever in Hawaii, but it trended it went viral a couple of years ago. And following that trend, this person, American man, tried to open up Aloha Poke Company and tried to document the name and sent out sort of cease and desist letters to people, other businesses that had the word aloha, because he was trying to copyright that name. And that sparked all kinds of outrage. I think if we had some kind of entity, Diana, or like an institution that protected that from happening, a mechanism to protect linguistic, cultural appropriation or misappropriation, we would probably have, I think we would feel more empowered, I would say. Isn't there? Yes, I think, Jean, the initial seed for that motivates someone to learn a language can just be love or interest. Very unique name of it. That's always the question. Is a name in a certain language indication that the language is living? And there's debate around that. Some people say yes. Others might disagree. I think you can't say yes or no without considering the reality of that language. And so the reality for Hawaiian language is it's not given much support from the top. And most support for Hawaiian language is grassroots. So we're, in that case, in that sense, because of that, we're very sort of protective of our language. And an outsider just using it to have a nice name, say, for some people, can be disingenuous and perhaps offensive. Diana, I'm not sure what happened. I don't think that business owner, I'm 99% certain he did not succeed in copywriting the word aloha. Well, thank you all for a very lively discussion in the chat. I don't feel like I'm just talking to a screen. And I actually have to go teach Hawaiian language now. But please feel free to be in touch, I think via Anna, if you folks would like. I can leave my email real fast. It was also on the slide. But this is my email, and please feel free to reach out and be a friend. And mahalo for attending. Gail says, this is something we deal with almost daily. Bridge for SH and word phrase for their technical piece of paperwork. Yeah. Yes, I can identify with that difficult situation. And there are more and more people who get it nowadays. There is an awakening happening. And Laura, absolutely correct. The literal translations just don't. They don't work across languages, especially languages that are not related. Mahalo, ebitare. And I'll see you folks hopefully in the future. Aloha.